To Taylor, who is one of the Uni Connect Outreach Coordinators at AccessHE, to talk to the forum about the attitudes of young Londoners to HE.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Graham, for your presentation. I'm hoping that parts of what I'm going to be talking about today help illuminate some of those broader issues that are facing the class of 2021. But I'm also going to dip in or go back in time a little bit to the first lockdown and how that has shaped attitudes to HE. So to begin, if I move the slide, the first thing I just wanted to discuss was basically, a little bit about the data and the methodology behind it. So although AccessHE commissioned the research, YouthSight coordinated the polling for the data and collection in summer 2020. So the sample itself that I'm going to be talking about is made up of 1,000 Year 12 and Year 13 students, split evenly between London, the southwest of England, the north of England, and the Midlands. For the purposes of this presentation, I've conflated that group to compare it to London directly. So the questionnaire was made up of 30 questions and surveyed attitudes towards HE. Given the breadth and depth of the data, I won't be able to sadly go through all of the findings, but hopefully I can provide a little more detail on the challenges faced by the class of 2021 and more specifically kind of decision-making processes that might have contributed to HE rates this year and next year. Some of the data that I'm going to be talking about will probably confirm expectations about young Londoners, but I also hope a couple of points might confound recurrent narratives that we associate with young Londoners' progression to HE. So to begin, I wanted to look at kind of lockdown learning. So before I go directly into talking about these HE attitudes and decisions, I wanted to reflect on what the data showed about the transition to online home learning and the continuities and differences between young Londoners and other young people in the country and how this might have affected their HE decisions in the future. So if we look at our first two graphs here and the data that I've pulled out, on the left we have a graph showing the amount of hours worked by per student during every day during lockdown, and on the right how much engagement students were having with their teachers online. So again, in case of any confusion, this data strictly refers to lockdown 1, not lockdown 2, when schools were closed. However, I don't think this nullifies the significance of this data, especially given that obviously a lot of WP departments are working solely online on a digital basis, at least until maybe the beginning of the next academic year. So the first thing worth noting, and perhaps to some of our surprise, according to the left-hand graph, young Londoners report a significantly lower amount of daily work compared to the rest of the country during school closures. So according to this graph, 55% of young Londoners studied for less than 2 hours a day, compared to 44% in the rest of England. So this lack of engagement might be explained by adjacent factors like study space and digital access, which I'm about to talk about. But more worryingly, the graph on the right shows how throughout the country, regardless of London's situation, approximately 25% of students that were surveyed claim that they received actually no online teaching sessions with teachers or college lecturers, which is obviously very concerning. In terms of how this is translated into digital access, we can see how this might be explained to some extent by a lack of access to laptops and internet, as represented by these two graphs. So during the first lockdown, discussion within WP departments focused on questions of digital poverty and the digital accessibility amongst Londoners. But according to our data, these levels are roughly in line with the rest of the country, with a majority of students within and outside of London claiming that they had uninterrupted access to the internet and a sole computer / laptop or tablet. That said, the data also makes clear that this kind of access is far from universal. 31% of young Londoners reported that their access to internet was shared, and 1 in 25 young Londoners never had access to a sole computer, tablet or laptop. And this is important because it compares to 1 in 50 outside of London. So it's clear from this data or our sample that young Londoners are at a significant disadvantage when it comes to accessing digital equipment. So when it comes to finding a suitable place to study, as represented by this graph, we see that young Londoners also are at a slight disadvantage compared to the rest of England. The majority of young Londoners, 51%, have either no access or shared access to what they might define as a suitable place of study. This might go some way in explaining the study time deficit examined on previous slides. So to make this point, 1 in 20 young Londoners represented here claim that they have never had access during to a place of a suitable place of study during the first lockdown, which is very concerning and significantly higher than those throughout the rest of the country. So to move on to how these kind of these factors affect HE information and guidance, we also conducted research that which asked about the effectiveness of outreach and HE information and guidance during this lockdown period. So with regard to study and career guidance, London marginally outperformed the rest of England in terms of online delivery, led by school teachers and lecturers, as well as current students. However, as the graph shows, surprisingly, the data appears that young Londoners report just a very small, well, a 5% lower level of engagement with online sessions led by universities. This is slightly worrying and strange considering the high proportion of HEIs in London. More concerning though are the 29% of young Londoners who report no support at all when it came to future study and career choices. So to move on to my next point, it's interesting though when we come to compare this to the impact on general opinions of HE in light of the coronavirus pandemic. So within and outside of London, most students do believe that HE is still a good option in the context of the pandemic. But simultaneously, we do have a significant level of students who express a skepticism towards the reliability of HE as an option in COVID-19 times. What would be useful is if we had a prior notion of how this might have changed, but I'm thinking that this is quite significant, this 44% on the left. So overall, however, it seems from our data that we collected throughout the country, those people who, or young people who are likely to go to university, those who declare themselves likely, have quite a high level of faith in HE, regardless of whether they're in London. So 84% of Londoners, regardless of the pandemic, want to be a student and experience student life, however different that might be today. 87% are motivated by the opportunity to study their specific subject at university. 79% believe that HE is the best way to make impact in the world. And perhaps most impressively, 90% believe that their job prospects are better if they go into HE. So what was striking about this data is that even though coronavirus has thrown up many important questions in terms of progression to HE, overall HE remains a popular choice for young Londoners and young people across the country. And I'm just going to move on. So lastly, I wanted to look at how the survey reflected a few very specific questions around how coronavirus has affected HE decision making. So if we firstly, I wanted to look at these, again, differences between London and the rest of England. So noticeably, 38% of young Londoners expressed increased concerns about financing HE because of coronavirus. Though young Londoners report less of an increase when it comes to the opportunity to attend university close to home or live at home during following coronavirus, as shown in the bottom two data sets there. This is probably more likely to be related to the fact that we have very high pre-existing rates of commuter students in London and students who live at home. So despite the effects of coronavirus, this data shows that 25% of young Londoners and 30% of pupils in the rest of England believe that coronavirus has actually increased their likelihood of going on to HE. In line with what Graham was also talking about, kind of examining on a ethnic basis, I also wanted to look at these differences nationally between attitudes of white and BAME students throughout the country. So unfortunately, because the sample size for London was approximately 250, we couldn't disaggregate that figure and extrapolate any kind of meaningful data. So I've decided to show it on a national scale, and hopefully this can illuminate a few points around the London situation. But according to analysis done by AccessHE and YouthSight, BAME and white respondents are largely consistent in their attitudes to how HE has been affected by, or their attitudes to HE has been affected by the coronavirus pandemic. As with the previous slide, both BAME and white students report a significant increase in concerns about the affordability of HE, however. And finally, I think this is perhaps the most important point. Again, I wanted to show a national picture, and I wanted to look at how these problems are magnified when we distinguish between FSM claimants and non-claimants on a national scale. Though we did have some data related to POLA, again, as Graham said, I wanted to avoid using that because we are talking about a London context, and we all know how unreliable POLA is in the city. So though increased concerns about the affordability of HE are high regardless of ethnicity and regional geography, this graph clearly shows that coronavirus has had a massively disproportionate effect on students claiming free school meals, and by proxy, students who from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. The last two questions in particular, those that relate to study at home and choosing a HEI close to home, show a substantial increase among free school meal claimants. So to sum up, I know that I'm probably running out of time. I wanted to just demonstrate a few key findings that I found from looking at the data. So firstly, though access to internet is high across those who were surveyed, 1 in 25 young Londoners had no access to a sole computer, laptop or tablet. Since this research has been carried out, these figures may have changed, they may not have. However, this figure, nevertheless, in my opinion, underlines the necessity for a collaborative approach between HEIs and local authorities, as well as third parties, to ensure that no student is left without adequate learning equipment. This concern is compounded by the lack of study space for young Londoners, which is higher than the rest of the country, and means that 1 out of 20 surveyed, 1 out of 20 young Londoners surveyed, have no access to a suitable study space. As discussed, these issues may contribute to a significant study deficit amongst young Londoners, the majority of whom were studying for less than 2 hours a day during the first lockdown. And though the data shows that opinions about HE in general remain highly positive, especially as related to the job market, coronavirus has had a specific impact on concerns about student finance and living arrangements. These figures are consistent across the country, regardless of ethnicity. However, the data does show that the decisions of FSM claimants have been acutely affected by worries about coronavirus. Overall, I think it can be said that while Londoners report significant differences when it comes to home study and digital accessibility, for the most part, opinions about HE are consistent throughout the country. Though this regional perspective can help explain some of these issues, predictably, it has been students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, regardless of their locality, whose attitudes towards HE have been impacted the most by the coronavirus pandemic. So this brings me to the end of my very quick tour around this subject, but I welcome any questions on the data that we collected and some of those key findings in particular, I think.